повністю. Right.
Wasserstoffaktien stehen nach wie vor im Hauptfokus vieler Anleger und auch die Regierung ist unbeschränkt.
Show. The great melodist. He's always good for bell canto tune or Polish dance rhythm, isn't he? Tune or Polish dance rhythm, isn't he? It's safe to say that the last movement of Chopin's second sonata shows us a different side to the composer, one not always fully appreciated. In addition to his well-known lyrical gifts, he was also a great innovator, especially when it came to harmony, be it the opulent coda of his Barkovov or the pervading chromaticism of spinal mazurka, it was Chopin's inventions which helped map the harmonic terrain for future generations of composers. Of all his works, though, the finale of the second sonata stands out as being particularly forward-looking. After three more or less conventional movements, the sonata form, a scherzo, and a certain funeral march, this final fourth movement comes across as a bit of a shock. A single line played by both hands an octave apart hurtles breathlessly up and down the keyboard for the movement's entire short duration. With no tempo, textural, dynamic variability, the music seems to blur into a single undifferentiated tangle of notes. The work's themes, architecture, and tonality are rendered hidden, which led Ligeti to claim that this was probably racial. With no tempo, textural, dynamic variability, the music seems to blur into a single undifferentiated tangle of notes. The work's themes, architecture, and tonality are rendered hidden, which led Ligeti to claim that this was probably the first atonal piece in the history of music. That's quite the claim. Could this really be atonal? Well, surely not in the 12-tone Rose sense of the word. We are in a key, B-flat minor. It's just that it's often quite hard to tell. At the beginning, for example, we're completely adrift with the first theme, if you can call it that, based on unstable, half-diminished and diminished seventh chords. We quickly arrive at the tonic, just stable, half-diminished and diminished seventh chords. We quickly arrive at the tonic and just as quickly move on from it, and you'll be forgiven for missing it entirely considering the abundance of passing and chromatic notes which dilute this all-important chord. Soon after, we have passages like this, formed of chromatically descending triads. Now, chromaticism is hardly rare in romantic piano music. What is rather rare, however, is to have a chromatic line where every other note is dislodged from its usual position and shunted down the octave. Such a line is woven through this angular passage, yielding some immensely dissonant intervals on strong beats of the bar. Again, you'd be forgiven for losing the tonal thread here, if we ever grasped it in the first place. Another reason why it's so hard to detect a prevailing tonality is simply that there's no vertical harmony. In so much of Chopin's music, the left hand is assigned the role of accompanist and provides chordal support for the right hand. As a result, no matter how complicated a certain right hand line might get, it's usually always clear how it fits within the broader harmonic context. But as we know with this finale, both hands play the same single line of music. We lack any sort of accompaniment which explicitly spells out the chords for us, and instead must follow harmonic progressions that are articulated horizontally over the course of several notes. This isn't such a problem when the music's formed of broken chords, but when it's formed of scales, which it very often is, it once again becomes tonally disorientated. Take this hair-raising sequence as an example, littered with dreaded double flats. With precious few broken chords to go on, it's only through highlighting certain notes within the scales, emphasized either by meter or contour, that we can begin to uncover the harmonic scaffold. Whether you can hear this scaffold in performance is a question we'll get onto in a moment. Regardless, it seems to indicate modulation to the relative major D-flat. Initially in diminished seventh territory, the music passes through the Neapolitan. Then, after the briefest and most tenuous of dominant preparations, we arrive in D-flat for the word second. Right, now back to the question of whether we can actually hear any of the underlying harmonic framework, because this is central, I think, to what Ligeti meant when he described the piece as atonal. Well, a lot of it comes down to the performer, but the choice of tempo, dynamic, articulation, and pedal will all profoundly impact the level of detail a listener can become. Play it more slowly, and the form dissipates, revealing harmony but also melodic fragments that were hitherto concealed. Personally, I think I can, at least more than I used to. Bear in mind, though, that analysis can dramatically colour the listening experience. When I listen, it's possible that I'm filling in the gaps, perceiving a more harmonically coherent piece than is actually resonating from the piano strings. This work might best be described then as theoretically tonal, but experientially atonal. Or maybe I'm just overthinking it. Anyway, I'd love to hear what you think in the comments. How does analysis inform or distort your listening? And is a piece coherent even if you can't hear that coherence? If you enjoyed the video, be sure to subscribe. I'd love to build a little community here and connect with like-minded people. Thanks, and see you soon.
Beaucoup de personnes ne le savent pas, mais le meilleur moyen de gagner de l'argent dans les cryptos n'est pas d'aller analyser les cryptos une par une. Ce n'est pas non plus
Так нет, обороты. Birthday. Чисто чанно. Машина. Чего это? Ой, едят тебя налево, блин. Самый.
Wenn du mehr als 10.000 Euro auf einem Bankkonto hast und nicht willst, dass das Geld bald in Flammen aufgeht.
Hey everybody, I'm Rick Beato. My guest today is Pat Metheny. I've been wanting to interview Pat since the beginning of my channel. Pat, it's a pleasure to see you. Now, I want to say, let's see, I met you backstage on October 10th, 1981. You were playing in Ithaca, New York. I think it was called the Strand Theater with a group. You were 26 years old back then, and I was a sophomore in college. I saw you play well, many times with the group. I saw you with Charlie Hayden and Billy Higgins at the Village Vanguard in 1984, which was a phenomenally great show. I absolutely love your guitar playing. You're a huge influence on me. And I have many questions to ask you.
Okay, I'm very, very happy to be here with you, Rick. I mean, your thing is really special, very unique. You're doing an incredible service to musicians, to your listeners and followers. It's, you know, I mean, everybody I know is like following your thing because it's really interesting to look at music in this detailed way. And you're like in a very unique sort of position as a musician to understand so many aspects of it, to then be able to explain a lot of things to a lot of people that maybe they haven't thought of before. And it's great. So I'm very, very happy to be here with you today.
Cool.
Thanks.
Okay, so we're going to go back to December of 1975. I know you have a great memory, Pat. When I interviewed Gary Burton, he talked about making the Dream So Real record music of Carla Bley. The 2 days I'm making a record, because back then ECM records were 2 days, I guess, right? And then Jocko came over, and Bright Side's Life was going to happen the next 2 days, he said. So Jocko arrives that day, and you're getting ready to do this, and you're making this record, it's your first solo record. Tell me about that. What was it like? What was the studio like? Give me the vibe.
Well, you know, it's great that we're starting with Gary because so many things for me are kind of really informed by the significance that Gary had on my life. First, as a fan, you know, the Gary Burton Quartet of the late '60s. As much as people talk about Bitches Brew and stuff that happened a little bit in, later in '69, '70. Back in '67, '68, Gary's band was kind of already pushing the edge of what was kind of going to be culturally finessable within the world of improvised music. And, that band was like, that was the Beatles for me, that band. And I had all their records, followed it really closely, along with everything else that I was following, which was, my early years around Kansas City. I was very lucky to play with great older musicians, guys who could really play, and most of that was kind of in the vernacular of the time, playing organ trio type stuff, and CTI type stuff was very popular then, and so I was kind of hanging in that zone. But Gary's thing was something that definitely had nothing to do with what the Kansas City thing was, but I loved that stuff. So, the dream gig for me would have been to be in Gary Burton Quartet, I mean, that would have been like being asked to replace George Harrison or something. Right. And that's what ended up happening very quickly. Yeah. I was asked to perform on a festival in Wichita, Kansas. Got to play a couple tunes with Gary, got to know him, and then a bunch of other stuff, but very quickly I was in the Gary Burton Quintet, then Quartet. Yep. And when I joined Gary's band, we made a record for ECM, and the idea came up that maybe I would make a record, which at the time I was 19, and for me that was like, yeah, let's do that tomorrow, And Gary, being the person that he is, had, I think, felt like maybe he got pushed into making his own records a little too soon. He started making records on his own, I think, when he was 16 or 17. Yes, really early. And he, to me, was like, you should wait until you can make the record that may be the only record you ever make, because it might be. And, also I was playing in his band every night. He was a very tough leader in a good way. But there would be several hours of conversation after almost every night. You're doing this, you're not doing that, you're doing this. But then he would go out and, not just him, Swallow too, and Moses would basically do everything he just said that I should do. And of course they were right. So in that year, I really developed by being around them. And Gary's thing also was the material that I had at that time, because I was submitting whatever I was writing to him. He just felt like it was fine, but it wasn't, that one record yet, because I may only make one record yet. And he kind of took it upon himself to let me bring tunes. He and I would do demos in his basement.
He told me that, actually.
Yeah. And I remember when I wrote the tune Bright Side's Life, took it over there, said, okay, now you've got the first tune on the record. That's what you should be doing. Follow that thread. Because that, I don't know what that is. He said, everything else you brought in, I know what that is. But that one, that's something else. And the thing is, for me too, that tune crystallized something, which was this idea of you've got to be able to play on the changes, you've got to be able to really deal with like Coltrane stuff, you've got to be able to hang in all 12 keys on any standard, you've got to be able to do all that. Now that you can do that, don't do that. Right. And also, there's nothing wrong with triads. You know?
Oh, this is a subject that we're going to get to.
Yeah, and I love triads.
Right.
You know, I'm like, you know, I like all the stuff, but you know, I really like just kind of hanging on D.
Yeah.
And why not? Why are
not?
we not doing it?
Right.
So anyway, that sort of set the table in a way, but it's also got some kind of 12-tone stuff going on. You know, it's sort of, I mean, the basic arguments laid out on that record for sure, but almost in that tune, that's pretty much what I've been, you know, I still stand by that in a lot of ways. So anyway, I had that tune. And then the next thing was, you know, ECM, you know, that's Jack DeJohnette, that's Ray Holland, that's, you know,
Jarrett, everybody,
these guys.
Yeah.
It's like, you know, maybe I'm going to do a record with those guys. That was a possibility. Gary was like, why would you want to use those guys when you've got this really great band with that bass player, you know, that guy that you keep bringing up here, he's really good. And I'm like, you mean Jocko? Because at that time, nobody knew who he was or me or anybody. You know?
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, we had a band.
Yes,
He and I were we used to do gigs in Florida when I was living in Florida, and I was, you know, around there, and we'd play with, like, female impersonators for a week on Miami Beach as the pit band, you know, and he and I immediately became really good friends, and when I started to, you know, I moved to Boston to join Gary, and I was teaching at Berkeley. It was like, come on up, and I got this great drummer, Bob Moses, who's playing with Gary, you know, let's play some trio gigs. And then it became a regular thing, and we started playing around.
So you guys would play around Boston?
Yeah, we were a real band.
Okay.
We were a real band.
Okay.
And Gary was like, you ought to use your band. They know your tunes, and, you know, it's kind of an interesting sound with this bass player and everything. I'm like, yeah, okay, you're right. So we then, you know, we went to, you know, like you said, Dream So Real, and I think we only had a day officially to record. Jocko had never been to Europe.
Okay.
And I mean, you know, everybody wants to talk about Jocko a lot. I mean, and there was a Jocko version later that was another Jocko than the one that I kind of knew in a way. He was the only guy I ever met who was as straight as I was. You know, he had never been drunk or drank anything.
Right.
And we were like that. He and I were like, wow, we got this thing. He had never been to Europe. He was still, you know, Jocko. It wasn't like he was some other guy. He was Jocko. So he flew to Europe and, you know, was really excited to be in Europe. And anybody who's ever international traveled knows there's this jet lag. Yeah. So he stayed up the whole night, the first night he was there, while we're finishing Dreams Are Real. Okay. We're going to have 6 hours the next day.
Was he hanging in the studio with you guys?
No. He was just walking around Stuttgart. Okay. Because he's like in Europe, in Germany.
Yeah.
He's just walking around, which is what I did the first night I was in Europe, too. Sure. So then it's the next day, and I go knocking on his door, and he's like out. He's asleep, of course. I'm like, we got to record, man. You know, we got to be up in Ludwigsburg, which is a little bit outside of Stuttgart, you know, in an hour to do this record. He's like, okay. And he takes a shower. And we go there, and, you know, of course, he doesn't have his acoustic 360, which was a big thing for him. It's whatever the studio amp is, which he was like, oh, man, I don't know if I can get my sound, you know. And me, too. I don't even know what I had, but I had the 175 for sure. So anyway, we start recording. And in a flash, 1 or 2 takes.
And you were used to playing with you guys were used to playing with each other.
Yeah, we were a band. We all knew the tune.
Yeah.
The only tune that we didn't know was the tune called, I always called it B&G, and it ended up being called Midwestern Night's Dream. Because I had been messing around with a lot of odd tunings of 12 strings.
Right.
and I had this thing, and I thought this will be cool, and then I'll, also the other thing for me, honestly, was like, wow, we're in a studio, maybe I can do an overdub. I don't think I'd ever done an overdub. Back then, that wasn't that common, in 1975 or whatever, you didn't have home studios or anything.
Yeah.
You'd have to go rent a studio to do that. I'm like, okay, so I'm going to play this thing on the 12 string, and then I'm going to overdub on it. Play a solo or something. So we got as far as we got on that first day, which was most of the record.
Okay.
But it was agreed that we would come back the next day and finish and mix.
Okay, and Gary was hanging out in the studio.
Well,
right?
the point of all this is Gary was the producer of the record.
Yeah.
And the fact that he's not credited, I think, is really a shame. Because he was the guy. He was there. I mean, the other guy was there too, and certainly he's a very famous producer. But Gary, in terms of what producers do, from beginning to end,
he was production and everything.
Yeah, absolutely.
Bringing the tunes and working.
Absolutely. And also, he's Gary, so I mean, he's a great musician, of course.
Was he commenting on the takes as you guys were doing it, or were you just kind of rolling one after another?
I don't remember much commenting other than, sounds good, let's do the next one. And me going, can we do it one more time? No, sounds good. And I mean, I don't think there were more than 2 takes of anything. So that led to the last thing we did, which was this Midwestern Night Stream thing, which I tried to overdub a solo, and it really, even I knew it didn't work. And then I was like, I want to write a melody then. So I went back and wrote this melody for Jocko to play, which is what happens on the end of the tune.
Yeah.
Which, I still vividly remember writing it in the hotel room in Stuttgart, and then Jocko coming up and playing it. That's what that was. So we did that overdub. And also, as far as I was concerned, it was a disaster. We had played lots of gigs, and we didn't sound anything like what I was hearing coming back through the speakers at all.
Right.
And, that happens to musicians a lot.
Of course.
In general.
Yeah.
With, I was pretty green then. I had done a couple of records with Gary and a few little things here and there, but I didn't really know what was going on. All I knew is what I heard was not at all what I thought we sounded like. And besides that, I thought I just sucked. And, and I knew I particularly sucked because on Bright Side's Life, there was a big clamp. I just messed it up. And I was like, can we do an edit? Because I had read about edits. And they were like, no. I'm like, but this part, it's like, or can I punch in or something like that? And if you listen closely, you will hear that there's something funny. I can't remember exactly where it is, but I think I punched in, and I had the tone control in a different place or something. There's something very weird in the middle of Bright Side's Life in the guitar department. Next thing I knew, it was over. And we're going, that was it.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about the language of your early music. This language is really unique to just a small group of people, and especially you. Where does this come from?
Let's go first to just the music part of it.
Yes.
Just what that is. I mean, when people say triads over bass notes, really, mostly we're talking about inversions.
Or if you're talking like A over B flat or something, that's in,
It's
things
just
like that.
another way of calling a seventh chord,
Right.
Something else.
Yeah.
And also, I think very effectively giving a clue to the person that's going to play it, how you might want it voiced, and maybe more to the point you're bringing up of how you want it to function.
Yeah.
Because if you say B flat sus, that's a little different than A flat over B flat.
Right.
It's the same thing, but in B flat sus, that's a little different than A flat over B flat.
Right.
It's the same thing, but it means something a little different.
Yeah.
But I have to really always go to the tune Falling Grace.
Yep.
by Steve Swallow,
Steve Swallow, yeah.
which to me somehow opened the door to something.
Yeah.
And I'm not quite sure I could place what that is exactly. But it was, to me, that tune sort of started a way of thinking about harmony that was kind of not exactly linear in the sort of, Tin Pan Alley kind of way. It was more like the individual movements. It could be the bass note. It could be the way a common tone cuts across more chords than usual.
Yeah.
There were the individual movements. It could be the bass note. It could be the way a common tone cuts across more chords than usual.
Yeah.
There were so many different angles you could look at that set of changes. And I mean, I still do. I
Right.
still can. I mean, sometimes I'll just play Falling Grace in all 12 keys for 5 or 6 hours. It's just infinities kind of represented there. Not to mention this particular compositional device that he got to in that tune, where the tune wraps around on itself.
Right.
So to me, that tune was a breakthrough tune for many people.
Yes.
I mean, it just sets a slightly different tone, and I was certainly responding to that. And in particular because we were playing it every night. That was like constantly the third tune in the set.
Okay.
And and not to mention that both Swallow and Gary would just eat it alive. And Swallow in particular, his soloing style, even on acoustic bass, but then he really effectively brought it to electric, is built on inversions.
Yes.
I mean, he's just constantly almost just spelling out chords with a few little things to connect them. It's just like this incredible buffet of how to think about harmony by really understanding how to invert the chords at least 3, sometimes 4 different ways, using the 7th as a pivot point or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's just a beautiful, incredibly eloquent, and unbelievably communicative way to explain harmony to an audience. And whether they know what they're getting or not, they are getting a full dose of what those chords mean.
But it doesn't sound like jazz to people in that way. This is what's different about this. This is why I think it communicated to people differently than jazz would, than typical jazz. Even though it was improvisatory music, it spoke to people differently because of the harmonic vocabulary that's being used.
Well, in my case,
Hi, I'm Sean Levine. I'm a writer, an artist, an editor, and a creative writer. The things that I'm passionate about are at the heart of all the books that I've written. I brought my love of baking into my book, 7 Sweet Things. Photography was the inspiration for my book, Snapshots of the Boy. And my book, Fees at a Sanatorium, and Isaac Rosenberg's Journey to Aros were inspired by painters and painters. Storytelling doesn't have to be about major conflicts and cliffhangers. The drama emerges when you slow down and notice the details of your imagination and what is there in front of you. In this sense, writing is no different from painting or drawing. The best way to make something creative out of your everyday.
I've always felt like one of the most effective things about the guitar is getting 6 people to sit around the campfire strumming chords. I mean, it's first of all, an incredibly great sound.
Yep.
And it's one of the best possible, ways to deploy the instrument into the world. I mean, it's just a fantastic use of the instrument that barely had been even looked at within the general vicinity of the kind of music we're talking about.
Well, if you look at New Chautauqua or It's For You, that's on the Asphalt Wichita record, you're actually strumming, and then you play over strummed chords, which you just never hear. I mean, rarely hear it even since then.
Yeah, and I mean, in particular, the one I would point to is 8081, to be doing that kind of rhythmic strumming.
That's right.
With a modern drummer like Jeff.
Right. Yes.
That to me was that was a kind of breakthrough moment. I always wanted to get to that.
Yeah.
Where we could really do the kinds of things like Elvin type things, but with strumming and all that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, even on 8081, it's a quite simple harmonic language.
Yeah.
It's more about this.
Yeah.
And it's very hard for me even now to find people who can do that.
Right.
even people who you would think could do that,
Right.
like I'm talking about rock, but sometimes it's like,
Just
can you
from
get
the
that
guitar.
wrist going? Like it should be rocking,
Yeah.
But then I see some people who can really do it, and I'm like, yeah, like that. And in this vicinity, I mean, there's a little bit of Gabor Szabo that kind of almost goes there. But, the main rhythm guitar function within our language has been more about kind of fitting in with the bass player, and the drummer of course, Freddie Green is the model.
Yep.
But there's a tradition of that.
Yeah.
Jim was amazing at that.
Yep.
Really do that. So to me, that was really like fertile ground. And then also the thing that you're referencing about having this staying kind of the same, creating kind of a horizon, but having the stuff going on under it changing, and then maybe little bits of the horizon changing. That was just an image thing for me from Missouri, right? Could be bluegrass, could be country, could be whatever that was, but to me that always had a resonance. It was very personal. And yeah, Right Size Life is that.
On Missouri Uncompromised, you played just that little triad thing, da, 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 right at the end of the,
Which is, you didn't hear too many triads prior.
No.
Not to mention that the entire blowing form, which is a blues, is about major triads.
Yes.
And that was, that seemed like worthy ways of creating some kind of exposition on what Gary had sort of, like said, okay, you're on the right track with Bright Side's Life. Those seemed like good responses to that validation.
Do you think that the Jocko also, on songs like that, it was unlike anything that he played on other records? It really was. I felt like,
well, he
as an accompanist,
he hadn't played on any of the other records.
Yeah, but even after that, the way that he's playing behind you was unlike the accompaniment that he would play on other records. That I thought it was really unique to that record. There's a certain style that he played in.
Well, I mean,
Mm.